Hi everyone, welcome back to English 112. This is for our class for Tuesday, the 27th, where we are discussing three short stories, Young Goodman Brown, Soldier's Home, and Battle Royal, which means that after these three short stories, we have just two left in our short story unit. Both are quite short, about a page, page and a half or so. Girl and Popular Mechanics, which means that we're getting near to the point where your first journal is going to be due. And according to our course outline, that first journal would be due this upcoming Thursday. That is the 29th by 11:59 p.m. And I ask that you send that to me via PDF to my email, ruiz@gcc.mass.edu, ruiz at gcc.mass.edu. And I'm asking that you select three short stories from the short story unit and that you respond in approximately a page or so for each of the short stories. So that would be approximately a 3-page journal. And you can talk about the stories as independent units if you'd so like, but you can also talk about the stories in a compare-contrast sort of format, whichever you prefer. And obviously you're not going to do an exhaustive review of these short stories. It's just a way for you to note observations, questions, reflections, more than just plot. And it could be in bullet point form. It doesn't necessarily have to be in complete sentences. And I evaluate it informally on a checkmark system. And hopefully this will help inform some of your choices for the paper, which we will be talking about very soon. In terms of these three short stories, I wanted to begin with Young Goodman Brown, which was written in 1835. And obviously, I think you can get a sense of that in terms of the language, which is rather archaic. That said, I think it very much gives us a historical sense of what New England and Massachusetts would have been like, and some of the reasons why Massachusetts is the way it is today. And Nathaniel Hawthorne is an author that perhaps you are familiar with. He is part of that canon, those works considered by scholars and critics considered to be worth literary study. You might have read something like The Scarlet Letter in high school, for instance. And Young Goodman Brown is an allegory, which means that the entire story is supposed to be representational. It's supposed to be figurative. So we can read it literally, but we're also supposed to read everything symbolically as well. So even think about the title, Young Goodman Brown. Young represents innocence and naivete. Goodman would have been a title at the time in the 1800s, much like we use Mr., but it also means a good man. And brown is also the color of soil. And might I suggest that this story, which takes place in the forest, so that soil is an appropriate symbol, is about how humanity is spoiled, or soiled, I should say, and humanity is soiled through sin. Now, this means that you needed to understand something about Puritanism at the time, and these were basically religious sects from the British that came to the United States because of religious persecution, and they founded New England, hence the term the England that is now new, which is where we are today. And the irony is that once they resettled to New England, they began to persecute others because of their religious beliefs. And you've probably heard of the individuals that were persecuted, the Salem witches, and this led to the Salem witch trials. And of course, is one of the calls for fame, unfortunately, for Massachusetts. And the Salem witch trials were basically propaganda in order to not only persecute religions outside of Puritanism, but also to highlight females in particular who were viewed as different and not following the status quo. So one of the things that Nathaniel Hawthorne oftentimes writes about is this particular time period because he is descended from some of the persecutors during the Salem witch trials. And Puritanism is a term you've probably heard of, and it's an ethic or belief in hard work and the postponement of earthly desires until the afterlife. And it might help explain why it is that you cannot buy liquor in certain areas in New England, in Massachusetts, on Sunday morning, because that was considered to be the day of worship. And those blue laws still exist. There have been some compromises along the way because, take our area for instance, which straddles a border. So the idea is that you can't buy liquor before noon on Sundays, but you can buy, because that would be the time in which you should be engaged in religious worship, but you could buy liquor after 12 o'clock. So that gives you a little bit of a sense of how some of our modern day has been shaped by Puritan ethos and ideology. And when we read Young Goodman Brown, we basically have the story of a man and his journey into darkness, into evil. And that journey is supposed to represent the life journey that we all take, where we have to confront the fact that evil exists everywhere, even within ourselves. And the idea in Puritanism was that either one was evil and damned, or one was good and holy and would be rewarded with the afterlife, and there was no in between. So this examination of how everyone has elements of evil within them would have been quite surprising during the time period in the 1800s. So what we see is Nathaniel Hawthorne making some rather bold religious commentary for his time period. And note the timing of when this occurs: sunset, which represents descent or darkness; the name of his wife, Faith, who is also a symbol for Goodman's religious faith. So when Goodman loses his wife literally, he also loses his faith symbolically. The wilderness, just think about the term wild or untamed, which is what the wilderness can represent. And they are newlyweds, which is also supposed to represent innocence. And that said, they've been married for 3 months. Three is a very significant Christian symbol from the idea of Trinity. And the traveler that Goodman Brown encounters along the way seems to be the devil. We don't know for certain. We know that Faith wants him, Goodman, to not proceed with his journey, but he insists and he continues forward, even though he knows that this is something that is negative, which illustrates the inherent curiosity of all humanity to walk down a path of possible evil. And again, when we read this particular story, we are very much tempted to try to determine whether or not the events are occurring or not occurring. And I think I might have mentioned at the beginning of the semester when I was talking about deconstructionists, those individuals who believe that there always is contradiction within text that negates meaning within the text, that we would be reading a short story that would lend itself very well to deconstruction, and it's this story. Because if you are looking for pieces of evidence to suggest that the witch meeting happened, you will find them, but you will find an equal number of pieces of evidence to suggest that the witch meeting did not happen and it was a figment of Goodman Brown's imagination. So Hawthorne does this deliberately, and in fact he even asks towards the ending of the story, was this a dream or did it really occur? And the response is, be it so if you will. In that other words, it doesn't really matter. What matters is not whether the events occur. What really matters is how Goodman responds to the events. That when Goodman thinks that the entire community is at this witch meeting, including the church leaders, and Goody Cloyce is particularly important because she taught Goodman his catechism. In other words, she was his Sunday school teacher. And all of the professionals are there, and the politicians are there, and the widows are there, and Goodman's family members are there. But keep in mind, Goodman too is there. The reality is that everyone has the ability to be tainted by sin. And that which meaning or dream ambiguity is perhaps part of the ambiguity that exists within humanity, that we have good and evil within all of us. The lesson to us, of course, is the hypocrisy that exists within Puritan society, and also the humanity that results in both good and evil in individuals. And I'll talk some more about young Goodman Brown next class and read some quotes, but I also wanted to talk about the other two texts. And Soldier's Home, written in 1925, will read much more like a contemporary text. Ernest Hemingway was known for his simple language, but that said, the story itself is not simplistic. And the title suggests what exactly is home. This is a soldier who has returned home from war, but of course, home is not necessarily the place where this soldier is understood or welcomed. Think about the distinction between a house, which is the physical structure, that's where Krebs is, and the home, which is a physical locale, and that seems to be where Krebs really is, because no one can really understand Krebs' struggles. In fact, Krebs himself is having difficulty understanding his struggles. Today, we would call it PTSD. At the time, it would have been known as shell shock. And this is very much a commentary not just about one particular war, but veterans of all wars, unfortunately. So I think that when we see the ugly reality of the military initially presented to us in the picture, that the uniforms don't fit and that ultimately the girls are not pretty. This is the ironic deflation of the romanticism that would have been associated with war, particularly during the First World War. And Krebs happens to be the surname of our main character. He's referred to as Krebs because you're usually referred to by surname in the military as a way to remove individual identity. And it also illustrates how Krebs is still a soldier even though he's left the war. Krebs means cancer in German, and one could say that war is like a cancer and can eat up someone. And we see how Krebs questions everything upon his return, including religion. And we assume that he has a religious background. Obviously, his mother's quite religious and she wants him to pray with her. He's unable to, so she prays. But Krebs also attended a Methodist college, so one assumes that, again, religion would have been a component of his life. And one assumes that the reason why Krebs is questioning everything is because of war. And how could religion exist in a world in which there is also war? We see how fickle and superficial the civilian society is right from the moment of his return, where the greetings were over for heroes because he had returned late, as if it was possible for somebody who would serve their country to be late upon their return. And we see how Krebs is basically isolated and he is engaged in solitary activities like reading, for instance, and eating lunch at home and playing pool. Pool is so significant in this story because in the game of pool, you aim and shoot, and soldiers, of course, aim and shoot. And he's also practicing the clarinet, again, solitary activities. And it's very clear that he doesn't want any relationship because he doesn't want consequences. And the assumption is because he had too many consequences in war, life and death consequences, and the dangers of forming relationship in war when you could easily lose someone. This is very much a dialogue-driven text. It's one of the reasons why it's easier to read because it's almost like a screenplay in some respects. And Harold, his first name, is the name that's used by his mother, which makes sense. Hare is the name, not Hair, Hare, is the nickname used by his sister, which suggests that perhaps he has a closer relationship to his sister, because usually when nicknames are used in relationship, that would indicate a greater degree of intimacy. But a hare, Hare, is a rabbit, which I think, again, very much illustrates Krebs in that he is scared and skittish and is fighting or is hiding in his hole, so to speak, the way a rabbit might. And the sister conversation with Krebs or Hare, I know might sound a bit odd when she asks, "Will you be my beau, my boyfriend?" And no, there isn't any kind of erotic element here. She's asking more in a kind of hero worship way, which is what his younger sister feels for Krebs. She doesn't understand really the implications. And of course, he says, "Yes, I'll be your beau," because this is a relationship that doesn't come with consequences, because he cannot ultimately be her boyfriend. That said, at the ending of the story, when he finally will watch her play indoor baseball, those are some of the consequences of having a relationship, which we could see as either positive for Krebs, a relationship with his sister, that is, not a romantic relationship. It could be positive for Krebs because he's getting out of the house and he's beginning to integrate into society. But it could also be negative because he doesn't necessarily want to do this. He's just doing this to pacify the family. His conversations with his mother are equally telling, as they spend a good amount of time talking about the car. The car is oftentimes a symbol of independence and freedom. It was something that Krebs was not allowed to use prior to his leaving for war, and now the family will offer him the car. He doesn't want the car because the cost is too high, because the assumption is if he takes the car, then he will begin to date and get a job, eventually marry, and reintegrate and become a quote normal unquote person, whatever that happens to be, whatever their expectations are. So Krebs is very suspicious of the car. And notice that while Krebs talks with his mother, who says she's trying to understand, but really she doesn't, and his sister, he never has a direct conversation with his father, which goes to show the element of distance that he has with his father. The ending, ultimately, Krebs decides that he's going to go to Kansas City and get a job. Again, this could be seen as positive because eventually he needs to reintegrate into society. Or it could be seen as negative because it doesn't necessarily seem like he's ready at this point to reintegrate into society and is merely doing it to pacify his family, not because he has a true need or desire to do this, which again shows the complexities of war and the complexities of being a veteran. And much like watching indoor baseball, we'll never know for certain whether Krebs is going to have a positive or a negative ending after this story is over. And I prefer the fact that they end it this way, with a certain level of ambiguity, rather than supplying us with an answer that might be unsatisfying for us as reader. And just like in real life, you don't necessarily know if things are going to end well or not. And there probably are elements that will be positive and elements that are negative. So, this, again, considering its time period, was quite a bold story for Ernest Hemingway to write about being critical about the impacts of war and how veterans are misunderstood. And Hemingway himself had experience with serving in the war, so it oftentimes is seen as his reflections on some level of his own experiences at war. And then Battle Royal was the third story. And again, next class, I'll talk some more about Soldier's Home and some quotation as well. The last story that I had assigned for today's class was Battle Royal, and this was from the novel Invisible Man, not The Invisible Man, which is a science fiction story, but Invisible Man, that was written in 1947. And the text happens to be about a black man who is unnamed in the novel, just referred to as Invisible Man. And he says he's invisible because he isn't seen as an individual. He's seen merely through the lens of his ethnicity, the color of his skin. And it's basically his reflections as an older adult upon his youth. And the story begins with the chapter Battle Royal, which ultimately was released as a short story. So even though we don't have time to read the novel, which is several hundred pages long, we do have the time to read the short story at least and be able to get a sense of the author's style and the incredible use of symbolism in this particular piece. And it's something that we've seen with short story, but this is not an easy thing to maintain over hundreds of pages, which Ralph Ellison was able to do. And both that was a blessing and a curse for his career. Obviously, it made Ralph Ellison one of those major players in that literary canon, but Ralph Ellison was also quite young when he constructed this piece, so the expectation was that he would at least be able to live up to this novel or surpass its greatness, and he was never able to do so. So in many ways, he lived in the shadow of Invisible Man, which is kind of ironic because there are lots of shadows in the text itself. And basically, I had said that we've got an adult narrator who's reflecting on their youth. We've got a prologue, and we didn't read the prologue. That would be part of the novel itself. But I wanted to tell you about the prologue. The prologue is about the adult narrator, and he happens to be hiding in a basement in a community that would not allow African Americans to move in during this time period. So he talks about how he was able to find a way around the exclusion and the bias and the prejudice that he would have found by moving into the basement, but he's surrounded by darkness. That said, he has found a way to light up the darkness with thousands, or at least hundreds, perhaps I'm exaggerating, with hundreds of electric lights, because he is stealing power from the power company. That's very symbolic because the entire novel is about who has power and how do you take that power from others. And as he is hibernating, so he says, and hibernating suggests that he's taking a rest before he considers what action to take in the future. He wants to tell us his story, and the story begins in his youth from when he graduated from high school and gave a speech, a graduation speech that was so impressive that he was asked to present this speech to the leading citizens of the town. And that's where our short story begins. And he tells us a little bit before he begins the speech about his grandfather, and that his grandfather had seemed to be the meekest of men, but on his deathbed, and of course, when one is on one's deathbed, one is likely to tell the truth. On the grandfather's deathbed, the grandfather says that he's been a spy in the enemy's country, and he's had his head in the lion's mouth, and that he's overcome them with yeses. What the grandfather is basically saying is that he's been acting meek, that this has not been the truth, but this was the way that he was able to infiltrate enemy territory. So this is how he's been a spy in the enemy's country. By acting meek, he was given access into some of Caucasian society in his attempt to try to overthrow it, and that he was living with his head in the lion's mouth, the lion being the prejudice that he had to experience. And the Invisible Man at that point doesn't understand what the grandfather's trying to tell him. He first needs to deliver his speech and also go through a series of episodes to learn that regardless of what he says or does, it doesn't matter, that he will ultimately never be accepted and never be included because of the color of his skin. But the Invisible Man, as a youth, right before college, is quite excited to be able to deliver his speech to some of the leading citizens of the town, the leading male citizens of the town. Again, think of the time period, the 1940s, because he's hopeful, the Invisible Man is, that he can prove to them that he has intellect and worth. And the leading citizens of the town instead enjoy humiliating and brutalizing the Invisible Man and other African Americans, as well as a naked blonde female that is placed there for their entertainment. And this naked blonde is objectified, and she has an American flag tattoo. So she is supposed to be right over her navel. So that is supposed to be symbolic of America itself. She represents America and the standard of beauty, where the men are able to look, but they can't touch. And that's supposed to represent the American dream as well, is that the disenfranchised can see the American dream, but they're never going to be given access to it. We see some brutal scenes in this piece, as well as the use of the N word, illustrating the time period and the horrors of the time, where basically the leading citizens have arranged to have a boxing match, a battle, in effect, between a group of black young boxers, and the Invisible Man has to participate. The Invisible Man believing that if he participates, then he'll earn the respect of the leading citizens of the town so that he can deliver his speech and impress them. Again, what ends up happening is that the Invisible Man is merely brutalized and humiliated and doesn't even realize that he's being brutalized and humiliated. Lots of black and white imagery in this text. Things like the tuxedos the men are wearing, black and white. The black cigars the men are smoking. In other words, they basically are consuming blacks for their pleasure. Even the white tissue paper that the scholarship, the Invisible Man, is eventually presented with. Again, tissue paper is very thin, insubstantial, very easily torn. So again, that what appears to be something substantial, the scholarship, is wrapped in white tissue paper, something that is not substantial. But the Invisible Man has to learn all of this, and he does begin to learn through the boxing match, which is a metaphor for the societal and personal battles that blacks and other disenfranchised groups have to fight every day, and that rather than fighting their oppressor, the system sets it up so that they are fighting their peers, basically for crumbs. The idea behind the boxing match is that the winner is going to be given some accolades and a financial reward. Even that is hollow. There is this sense that the fight is something that can't be won by the Invisible Man because it's already been fixed. There's another boxer there who basically refuses to, finally, when it's just the Invisible Man and the other boxer, to pretend to lose or win the fight, because his only pride at this point is in winning that fixed match. So the Invisible Man is brutalized and basically beaten to a pulp. When he says he's black and blue, he literally is black and blue. But think about the idea of how blue oftentimes represents sadness. And the blues, music is going to be very important in this piece, even though we don't necessarily get that sense in just this short story of Battle Royal, but it's something that we would see throughout the novel as a whole. And after the woman is brutalized, and after the men are embarrassed, because they are obviously sexually excited, they're wearing very tight boxer shorts. Again, this is a way that the leading citizens of the town can taunt and humiliate those individuals who are involved in the boxing match, where even looking at a white woman could result in some very negative consequences. And certainly it was something that the Invisible Man felt torn about, as he said that he wanted to protect this woman, but he also wanted this woman to be eliminated because of the position that she was putting them all in. And of course, the woman, because of her gender, is disenfranchised, just like the men in the boxing ring are disenfranchised because of the color of their skin. And after the boxing match, they are forced to scramble on the floor for their payment, and it's fake payment. It's just tokens on an electrified rug. The theme of electricity is something that will run throughout the novel, about again who has power and who doesn't. And then finally, after all of that humiliation, and again they fought for nothing, even the money that they were supposed to be getting isn't real. The Invisible Man gives his graduation speech about social equality, but at one point he makes an error and he says social responsibility rather than social equality, and nobody is taking any kind of, or social responsibility is what he's supposed to say, and then he makes the error of social equality. And then ultimately, once he stops saying social responsibility and he says mistakenly social equality, because those are two very different things, everyone in the audience falls silent. No one had been paying attention to him before, and they demand to know what he means by social equality. equality, and he says, oh, nothing, that was a mistake. I was swallowing blood. That's literal and figurative. So on some subconscious level, the Invisible Man does perhaps understand his grandfather's words and is fighting for social equality. But he's not ready necessarily to consciously admit that, even though he stated it by error. If you know anything about Sigmund Freud, oftentimes there are references to individuals who make misstatements in Freud's work. And he says that those misstatements aren't just errors, they oftentimes are references to what someone is subconsciously thinking. And when the Invisible Man finally is, quote, rewarded, unquote, with a scholarship to the, quote, Negro, unquote, college, he's thrilled because he thinks that this is going to lead to economic and professional opportunity. However, when he arrives home and there is this portrait of the grandfather that's there, it almost reminds me of Rose for Emily, with the portrait of Emily's father continually overlooking her. The Invisible Man has a dream, and it's a very disturbing dream about a circus, and that his grandfather is there and refusing to laugh at the clowns. In other words, the grandfather is refusing to play by the expectations of the time period. And the grandfather basically tells him to open up an envelope, which he does, and he's told that he's going to be kept running. And basically, again, this is his subconscious telling him that he is not going to be accepted at this, regardless of the fact of whether or not he has an education or he has a professional career. He's not going to be given equal opportunity because of the color of his skin. But on a conscious level, he probably doesn't realize that yet. He will realize that as the novel progresses. So I can tell you what happens as the novel goes on. And those leading citizens of the town, I should add, they always remind me of actually the individuals in Young Goodman Brown at the witch meeting. Again, these are supposed to be the respected individuals, and we see the ugly underbelly of who they truly are. But at any rate, the Invisible Man, for approximately 200 pages or so, goes to that college, and he realizes at the ending of his experiences that just because he's educated, that doesn't mean that he's going to be given equal opportunity. So he decides that what he really needs to do is to try to change the system, that the system is rigged in effect. So he tries to have political reform. And he spends a couple of hundred pages or so trying to do that. And he realizes that that also is not possible because the political system is rigged. And regardless of the political rhetoric that all men are created equal, and notice that leaves out 50% of the population, female. That's not the reality of it. So what he decides is that revolution is the only way to bring about equality. And the Invisible Man meets a character who's well named. He's called Ross the Destroyer because he destroys things. And they spend about another couple of hundred pages talking and engaging in revolution. And the end result is that their community around them is burning. A huge riot has ensued. And the Invisible Man realizes that all he's done is he's hurt his community and himself rather than enacted any kind of real social change. So he decides that what he needs to do is to, quote, hibernate, unquote, by taking some time to reflect. And what he does is that he finds a way to enter into a basement of an all-Caucasian neighborhood. In other words, the novel ends the way it begins. This is a circular novel. And he's surrounded by darkness in this basement, but he's rigged up hundreds of electric lights so he can illuminate himself. And again, this idea of darkness and light is a major theme, as well as the idea of electricity and power. As he reflects upon how is it he will be able to achieve, and others like him will be able to achieve, economic equality and social equality. And there are no answers that are given to us as a reader. And I think that's a brilliant way to end the novel, with the Invisible Man reflecting, because the challenge is for us as reader. Again, think about the time period, the late 1940s, to deal with issues like racism and classism and sexism, and to try to find solutions. If there isn't at least equality, at least to have less discrimination. And might I suggest that as we fast forward to 2022, there is indeed less. Certainly, we have a long way to go, but we've also progressed from the 1940s. So that gives you an idea of all three short stories, which I wanted to revisit next class, talk a little bit about some of the specific language in all three, and then end our short story unit with talking about girl and popular mechanics. Note we have a catch-up class on October 4th in the event that we need it. And for today's attendance question, since I've been oftentimes asking you about which pieces of literature did you feel attracted to or did you feel interested in, I thought we could do the opposite since we did three. Of the three short stories that were discussed today, Young Goodman Brown, Soldier's Home, and Battle Royal, which of the three did you dislike the most? And it's perfectly possible to dislike, as I've said, perhaps in one of my previous videos, but I've certainly said this throughout my entire teaching career, that my goal is for my students to have three lists at the ending of a literature class. The pieces of literature that they really enjoyed, and those would be the pieces of literature that they would pursue in the future, and other authors that are similar in terms of style or technique. And then the pieces of literature that they disliked, and then also the pieces of literature that they felt ambivalent towards. The thing is, everybody's going to have a different list because this is very subjective. And I encourage you not to dismiss the list of those works that you dislike, because over time, you might end up feeling very differently. I can't help but think about my own initial impressions of Emily Dickinson. I was not particularly a fan of hers when I was first introduced to her work in college, and I'll talk a little bit more about that when we talk about Dickinson. And now she's one of my favorite poets. The Dickinson texts haven't changed. I've changed over time. So again, out of the three short stories, which did you dislike the most and why? Again, there's no right or wrong answer. I'm just interested in your reasoning. And as I indicated, you're not required to respond to your classmates' responses, but you are required to read your classmates' responses as well as my responses to your and their responses. So that would give you a sense of what we would have talked about in class if we were meeting in person. So at this point, I should be all caught up with the discussion form responses. As you know, there was a little glitch last week where GCC lost its power in the middle of the week. That put everything a little bit behind with Moodle, but I should have caught up over the weekend, so now we can maintain our schedule. What I'll do next class, as I said, is talk a little bit about quotation from Young Goodman Brown, Soldier's Home, and Battle Royal, and then we'll end our short story unit with Popular Mechanics and Girl. I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and we will continue on next class. Take care. Bye-bye.